It's August 2025 and I'm at the top of a church tower in Maastricht in the southern Netherlands, but weirdly for such a famously low-lying country, there's a local hill that's even higher, and it's rock built this very tower. Capital of the Dutch province of Limburg, located on the River Maas and at the heart of Europe, sitting as it does on the Belgian border and close to the German border, the city is the birthplace of the European Union, with the signing of the 1992 Maastricht Treaty. It's perhaps fitting that the treaty that brought the European nations closer together than ever before was signed in a city that several of those European nations had besieged more than 20 times over the previous 500 years, including the Spanish, Dutch and French. In fact, during one of those sieges in 1673, the French captain of the Musketeers of the Guard, one Charles de Batz de Castelmont-d'Artagnan, was killed whilst besieging the city. He was real. Athos, Porthos and Aramis were fictional, created by Alexandre Dumas for the Three Musketeers. The city can trace its history back to around the year 50 as a settlement formed around the point where the Roman road from Cologne to the North Sea coast crossed the River Maas. In 384, Sint Servaas, the Bishop of Tongeren, modern-day Liège, died in the city and, in keeping with Roman burial rituals, was interred by the road leading into the city. Around 200 years later, a later Bishop of Liège had a church built around the grave of Servaas, which would go on to become the basilica that dominates the city centre today. Close to Aachen, seat of Charlemagne, the city, along with Liège, was considered the heart of the Carolingian Empire that would eventually lead to the evolution of both the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire. The city flourished in the 11th and 12th centuries, with the city coming under the dual authority of both the Prince-Bishops of Liège and the Dukes of Brabant. At the start of the 13th century, the first of the medieval walls were constructed. In 1275, the old Roman bridge across the river collapsed under the weight of the procession. Its thought the death toll was around 400. The replacement bridge was constructed shortly afterwards, slightly further to the north, and survives today as possibly the oldest bridge in the Netherlands, the Sint Servaasbrug or St. Servaas Bridge. The original fortifications of the city included a high wall with several towers and gates along it. At the southeasternmost point of the old city was the Hellport or Hell Gate. In 1867, King William III signed a decree that abolished the fortified status of many Dutch cities, Maastricht included, and in the following years most of the city's walls and fortifications were demolished as the old city centres were opened up. In some cases, a few of the towers and gates were saved from destruction, with the Helpoort surviving and now generally considered to be the oldest surviving city gate in the country, to go alongside the oldest bridge. Over the years, the gate has served a number of purposes, including as an artist studio and accommodation of the state archivist, but since the late 1990s it's been home to the Maastricht Fortress City Foundation, who've converted the upper floors of the gate building into an exhibition on the history of the city and its fortifications. A model shows the layout of a fortified city with the Hellport clearly marked, which with fortifications on the St. Servaas Bridge spanned both sides of the river, as well as the major religious buildings such as Servaas' Basilica, the Sint-Janskerk and the Basilica of Our Lady. Large touchscreen displays dotted across the museum provide much more information on the fortifications and the numerous occasions they were put for test, with major sieges taking place by the Spanish in 1579 and the Dutch in 1632 as part of the 80 Years' War. The French then had to go in 1673, with the Dutch returning the favour in 1676 as part of the Franco-Dutch War of 1672 to 1678. Undeterred, the French returned in 1748 towards the end of the War of Austrian Succession and had two more pops in 1793 and 1794 during the War of the First Coalition. Both of the two towers of the gates are still in use, creating a one-way system to get you around the museum, with a link between the two towers on the upper floor housing more exhibits. The western tower staircase, which you ascend up, is the original and consequently some of the steps are a little steep and worn, whilst the eastern staircase that you descend down was refurbished at some point before the museum moved in, creating a much safer descent. Just beyond the inner walls of the city are the outer fortifications, which are constructed and then constantly rebuilt after each siege and battle. Small sections have been rebuilt in recent years to give a better idea of how a fortified city would once have looked. Maastricht's strategic location as a major river crossing point put it at the heart of action for most of the 16th to 18th centuries, with multiple sieges and battles. In 1579, the city was sacked by the Spanish army led by the Duke of Parma, and for the next 50 or so years the Spanish crown took over the role that was previously held by the Dukes of Brabant in their joint sovereignty of the city. The Dutch finally reclaimed the city with Prince Frederick Henry of Orange and the Dutch States General replacing the Spanish crown in 1632. 2 years later, the Spanish tried and failed to recapture the city. French troops besieged and then occupied the city between 1673 and 1678 as part of the Franco-Dutch War, the original justification being that French supply lines were being threatened. During this siege, French military engineer Vauban developed tactics for breaking down the strong fortifications of the city that would become the standard approach for attacking fortresses until the 20th century. During the Austrian War of Succession, the French were back, and they briefly captured the city after a siege in 1748. The Revolutionary Army of France failed to take the city in 1793, but a year later they returned, and Maastricht was annexed into the French First Republic, where it stayed for around 20 years until the aftermath of the Napoleonic era, acting as the capital of the département of Meuse-Inférieure during this time. With the fall of Napoleon, the city became a part of the newly created United Kingdom of the Netherlands and was made the capital of the province of Limburg. That lasted for barely 15 years before the southern provinces ceded in 1830 in the Belgian Revolution. The Dutch garrison in the city remained loyal to King William I, even though most of the locals sided with the Belgian revolutionaries. Arbitration in 1831 by the Great Powers, Austria, France, Prussia, Russia and the UK, allocated the city to the Netherlands, but it wasn't until the Treaty of London in 1839 that the final borders of the Netherlands and Belgium were defined, with Maastricht and Dutch Limburg being separated from the Belgian province of Limburg, with the Maas forming the border to the north and south of the city, with the border being drawn around a kilometre from the eastern edge of the historic city centre, at that time being beyond the range of guns, so that no cannon could be fired from Belgium and hit the city. 4 years later, the Treaty of Maastricht, no, not that one, finally settled all the borders, and in doing so created the insanity of Bala-Hertog and Bala-Nassau, a disputed territory of 5,732 separate parcels of land that has led to a situation that in locations, the Belgian enclaves within Dutch territory contain a smaller Dutch counter-enclave within them. Feel free to Google it and disappear down a rabbit warren for a few hours. As with the rest of the Netherlands, the city remained neutral during World War I, but its location so close to a belligerent in Germany and a victim in Belgium meant it received a large number of refugees, which strained the city's resources. On the 10th of May 1940, Maastricht became the first Dutch city to fall to the Nazis, who attacked the city by surprise as they wanted to secure the crossings over the Maas ahead of their push into the Low Countries. The city was also the first Dutch city to be liberated, with the city declared free on the 14th of September 1944. The traditional industries of the city, such as the potteries, declined in the latter half of the 20th century. This coincided with a rise in service economy with the founding of Maastricht University in 1976 and several European institutions basing themselves in the city. The city hosted the European Council in 1981 and again in 1991, the latter of which resulted in the Maastricht Treaty, the founding document of the European Union, which created the basis for economic and monetary union, as well as cementing the single common market and customs union. The Sint Servaasbrug is regularly called the oldest bridge in the Netherlands, having originally been built between 1280 and 1298 to replace the destroyed Roman bridge that collapsed in 1275. However, the bridge itself has only been called the Sint Servaasbrug since 1932, simply being called the bridge before then. It was only the construction of the Wilhelmina Bridge 300 metres downstream that it needed to gain a name. It's also largely a post-1944 reconstruction, as a lot of the bridge was damaged by retreating Nazis, and that's before you find out that the two original piers were removed in the 1850s to create the channel for larger ships to pass through. A short walk from the bridge and you reach the Markt, the city's historic market square, completed with a 17th century town hall, and even to today it's still a thriving marketplace. But the largest square in the city centre is the Vrijthof, which has only been a public square since the 19th century. Prior to that, it was part of the Basilica of Sint Servaas. The name Vrijthof derives from the Middle Dutch Vrijthof, or free place. It designated an enclosed courtyard near a church where secular rulers had no jurisdiction. Archaeological excavations undertaken in the late 1960s in conjunction with the construction of a large underground parking garage underneath the Vrijthof revealed that the square is built upon ancient burial sites that include graves dating from the Roman period through into the Middle Ages. Whilst 335 graves have been documented, it's believed there's somewhere between 900 and 1,200 across the site. Further excavations in 2003 uncovered the remains of the original Roman road, the Via Belgica, which linked what is today Boulogne-sur-Mer with Cologne via the Roman bridge. The archaeological digs revealed at least 13 layers of road, of which only 7 are from the Roman period. Today, the square is home to 38 listed or protected buildings, including the 19th century Generalshuis, or General's House, which is now a theatre, the 18th century Hoofdwacht, or military guardhouse, and the most dominating the square, the dual churches of the Basiliek of Sint Servaas and the Gothic Sint-Janskerk. The oldest records for the square date to 1223, when Emperor Frederick II donated the area to the Basilica. In the Middle Ages, the square was walled with iron gates near the four corners. The square was the location for the outdoor display of the Basilica's relics during the septennial Maastricht shrine procession, where once every 7 years pilgrims would travel to Maastricht. For a number of years, the square was the site of the city's public executions, particularly for the most serious of cases, both religious and secular. In 1535, 15 Anabaptists were burnt at the stake in the square for heresy. In the 17th and 18th century, the square was used as a parade ground for the garrison, and around this time, the wall around the Vrijthof was replaced with a fence. During the 20 years of French occupation, the square was renamed the Place d'Armes. The dual churches of the Basilica of St. Servaas and the St. John's Church both back onto the square, with their entrances being located on other streets. Today, the Basilica is a Catholic church and Sint-Janskerk is Protestant, but they share a connected common past. With the growth of importance of the Basilica of St. Servaas on the pilgrimage trail, the church was struggling to cope with serving both the pilgrims and the parish, so a new church was constructed alongside it, Sint-Janskerk, or the Church of St. John the Baptist, to act as both a baptismal and parish church for the local community, leaving the Basilica to focus on pilgrimage traffic. Originally constructed around 1200, the current building dates from the 14th and 15th century, with most of the building being made from the local Limburg marl limestone, quarried from the hills of St. Petersburg, just a kilometre or so to the south. After the capture of Maastricht from the Spanish by the Dutch in 1632, the church passed into the hands of the Dutch Reformed community, with the Catholic wall paintings covered with a layer of whitewash. The two neighbours, now of rival factions, didn't always live in Christian harmony, with the church councillor St. Jan complaining about the wolf dancing and wild ringing of the bells of St. Servaas, suspiciously timed to disrupt the sermon being preached in St. Jan. Perhaps the most notable feature of the church is the striking red colour of the tower, though it hasn't always been this colour, with documents indicating that it was yellow in the early 18th century and white a century later. However, most restorations undertaken since the late 18th century, in 1774, 1822, the 1880s, 1967 and 1983, the tower has been painted red. In part, this helps to make the church stand out, but it also helps to protect the Limburg marl limestone from eroding and flaking away over time. A chemical reaction between the pigment in the paint and the stone hardens the outer layer, preventing it from flaking away so quickly. Today, Sint-Janskerk is also the only one in the city which has its tower open to the public, so you can climb up to the base of the tall lantern located on the top of the tower. The tower itself is a later addition to the church, being constructed in the latter part of the 15th century to replace the original tower that collapsed on June 8, 1366, after a violent storm swept through. From up here you get excellent views over the Vrijthof and surrounding densely packed city centre, and of course the neighbouring Basilica of St. Servaas. The current Basiliek van Sint Servaas is likely the fourth church to have been built on the site, the location of the grave of St Servaas, an Armenian missionary who was the Bishop of Tongeren, modern-day Liège, and died in the city around 384. Servaas was a widely travelled diplomat and a devout Trinitarian, a believer in traditional Catholic doctrine that God exists as three, the Father, the Son and the Holy Spirit, as opposed to Arianism movement that was active in the church for time that believed Jesus was a creation of God and therefore distinct from God. The presence of Servaas is recorded at several synods and church councils, including the Synod of Serdica, which was convened at Serdica, modern-day Sofia in Bulgaria, in 343. That synod can't be described as the most successful, as the aftermath was the first schism between the Eastern and Western churches that effectively created the Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic churches, though it is clear that Servaas was respected, as he's venerated by both congregations today. Naturally, given the bridge and the basilica, Sint Servaas is the patron saint of Maastricht, with a feast day on the 13th of May. The first church would have been a small memorial chapel built around the saint's grave. This was replaced by a larger stone church built by Bishop Monolf, also Bishop of Tongeren, around 570. Only about 100 years later, that church was replaced by a larger pilgrimage church, which was then replaced around 400 years later by the current structure that was built in stages from the start of the 11th century with the nave. The transept was built later in the century, and the choir and westwork the following century, though the official date of consecration, when that initial work on the nave was completed, is given as 1039. The mostly Romanesque church was built during a period when the chapter of St Servaas kept close ties to the Holy Roman Emperors, who at that time were based just a short distance away in Aachen, and consequently the church building has a lot of the characteristics of a German imperial church. There's certainly elements of the Aachen Dom to the rear of the basilica. The church underwent many changes during the centuries, with chapels being added, removed and amended, and the interiors being updated to reflect the changing tastes of the time. By the end of the 18th century, the interior of the church had been painted white, and the medieval stained glass windows had been replaced with colourless glass, making the church interior look more fitting to that of the Baroque church. At the end of the century, the chapter was dissolved by the French revolutionary forces who'd taken control of the city, and the church was used as a horse stable by the troops, with the furnishings of the church either sold, stolen or trashed. Around the same time, a suspiciously large number of the church's treasures also disappeared. The French forces returned the building to the church in 1804, but by then it was little more than an empty ruin, and the repair works that followed the return arguably caused more damage than the French forces had, with several chapels being demolished and significant changes to the internal layout of the church being undertaken. Much more thorough repairs were carried out between 1866 and 1900, during which some of the damage caused by the early repairs was reversed. In 1955, a fire caused the spire to fall through the roof of the church, which made another thorough restoration necessary, this finally being completed in 1991, though the spire was never rebuilt. Throughout the centuries, the presence of the grave of St Servaas and the crypt of the church, and the many relics in the church treasury, have drawn large numbers of pilgrims. The 7-yearly pilgrimage to the church was organised with nearby Aachen Cathedral and attracted tens of thousands of visitors to the region from at least the 13th century up until 1632, after which the capture of the city by the Dutch Republic led to the end of the septennial celebrations. The pilgrimage of the relics was revived in the 19th century and continues to this day, with the most recent having taken place just a couple of months before I visited in June 2025. And with a 7-year cycle, the previous one had been in 2018, so for once an event that hasn't been touched by COVID. The next one is scheduled for 2032. Even when the pilgrimage isn't on, you can head down into the crypt of the church underneath the altar to see the tomb of St Servaas. And the golden reliquary bust of St Servaas is the key exhibit in the basilica's treasury, located off the cloister of the church. The small collection, much smaller than it would otherwise have been, given that quite a bit of it disappeared during the occupation of the church by the French revolutionary troops, also has the usual selection of chalices, drinking horns and treasure boxes, as well as other reliquaries. Maastricht is in a relatively small club of cities that can boast multiple basilicas, given its size, with the Basiliek van Onze Lieve, or Basilica of Our Lady, also known as the Star of the Sea, just 500 metres to the southwest of St Servaas. Construction on the church is believed to have started around the same time as the final incarnation of St Servaas in the 11th century, though there is some evidence to suggest that religious use of the site goes back much further. The church is located within the walls of the late Roman Castellum, and there is speculation that the church was built either on or close to a Roman temple. A Roman shrine to Jupiter was located next to where the church now stands, though no archaeological work has ever been carried out on the church or the area around it to be able to confirm or deny the speculation. If it is built on the site of older churches, built on top of Roman temples, then it's possible that this is the site of the oldest church in the Netherlands. As with so much else in the city, the archives of the church were lost, or possibly stolen, during the period of French rule of the city at the end of the 18th century, so there's little information on the church or its construction before the 12th century, when other archives start to give information on the building. The imposing westwork and towers on the front facade are likely built using recycled stone from the walls and gates of the Roman fort that stood on the site from 333, with the ruins being demolished to make way for the new, larger church. Unlike the other basilica, the Basilica of Our Lady has undergone little in the way of changes since the 12th century, with only running repairs and minor alterations carried out in the intervening 900 years. As with its sister basilica, the church was used as stables as well as a magazine and cannon smithy during the period of French rule, and even after the Dutch took back control, it remained under the Dutch government for military purposes until 1837, when the parish managed to repurchase it back from the government and set about restoring it. Temporary repairs to reopen the church were insufficient, and by the end of the 19th century the building was in a poor state, requiring major restoration works to be undertaken between 1886 and 1916, during which most of the alterations carried out since the 12th century were reversed, and the church returned to how it would have looked shortly after its completion. During World War II, the church suffered some damage, but the worst damage was the theft of the basilica's large bells by the Nazis, likely for melting down and turning into weaponry. Next time, I continue my exploration of Maastricht by taking a cruise along the canal to Den Bosch, discover that rarest of things in the Netherlands, a hill, and head into the source of all that Limburg marl limestone.